Hi everyone, distinguished guests. On behalf of the expert in international trade at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, we welcome you to our webinar of the International Meetings series. Today's topic is an overview of the international development market spotlight on the International Finance Corporation. My name is Alexia Barbier, and I'm a project manager for international market development at the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal. I would like to use this time to thank our partner, Economic Development Agency of Canada for the regions of Quebec for its ongoing support of the World Trade Center Montreal's activities. Please note that there is currently an ongoing poll. If you can answer it, it will be greatly appreciated to help us to keep track on our internal goals. If you have any questions to our panelists, you can raise them in the designated Q&A box located on the bottom center of your screen, and we will address them towards the end of the webinar. You may ask your question in the official language of your choice, and I will be happy to translate for you if needed. Veuillez prendre note que ce webinaire est en anglais. Toutefois, si vous avez des questions en français, vous pouvez les poser, il me fera plaisir de les traduire. You will also receive a short survey that will appear in your browser at the end, which we invite you to answer to gather your opinion for future events. I will also send you a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include the presentation used today. Also, if you would like to watch this webinar again, we will make the recording available on the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal website, as well as on our YouTube page. Let me now introduce you today's speakers. Firstly, Fahim Noor Ali is a Climate Finance Trade Commissioner at the Embassy of Canada, Washington. And secondly, Kelly Videlska is an Economic Inclusion Advisor for the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group on the International Finance Corporation. I would like to thank you both for your presence today, and we will now officially start this webinar. Fahim, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Alexia, and thank you for the opportunity to present this topic to you. I'm really excited to be here. Let me switch to my screen quickly. Well, while I try and get this presentation, here we go. So, as Alexia had mentioned, my name is Fahim Noor Ali, and I'm a trade commissioner at the Embassy of Canada in Washington, D.C. As the title suggests, I focus on climate finance, which is, if you're familiar with the Trade Commissioner Service, you know that we do business development on behalf of Canadian companies in foreign markets. I focus on helping Canadian companies connect with organizations such as IFC, which is part of the World Bank, and other agencies around the world, along with my colleagues in London, Manila, and in Abidjan, to help you put your best foot forward when you're looking for investment or project finance. I also work very closely with my colleagues in the OLIFI, who you may be familiar with, or the Office of Liaison with International Finance Institutions, where they also work with these institutions, but more so on the procurement end. I actually, as part of this presentation, wanted to share a video that my colleagues in OLIFI and I had put together in partnership with the World Bank that sort of gives you an overview of what the World Bank is. So I will share that presentation right now.
For over 70 years, the World Bank Group has been the world's largest international financial institution, or IFI. Its 5 organizations work together to help developing member countries achieve the twin goals of ending extreme poverty and promoting shared prosperity. The bank group partners with governments, the private sector, regional development banks, civil society organizations, and other international stakeholders to advance these goals. A global leader, the World Bank has funded thousands of projects in over 140 developing countries through a diverse and expanding menu of financial instruments and technical assistance that include low interest loans, credits, and grants to governments, as well as investment and advisory services. Canada plays an important role as a shareholder with similar values and international development objectives. And as potential partners and suppliers, you can help the bank deliver on these results, helping real people overcome significant challenges to improve their lives. You would also contribute to meeting the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Through the bank group's private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation, also known as IFC. You can participate as a project developer, sponsor, or investor, helping to grow the private sector in developing countries and emerging markets. This can be done by unlocking investments that foster economic growth, sharing advice and expertise through advisory services that attract and encourage private investors, or helping to mobilize private capital for development, bridging gaps in markets where most needed. IFC works closely with other emerging market funders in key development sectors, such as climate, health, and infrastructure. And it engages with companies to finance unique solutions that address critical development needs. The World Bank's sovereign operations include operational work that touches on a wide range of industry sectors, from energy to education, infrastructure to information technology, transportation to healthcare, and everything in between. The bank.
So I hope that gives you a good overview of what the World Bank Group does, if you were not familiar with it before. As I mentioned earlier, I work with my colleagues in Washington with the Office of Liaison to International Finance Institutions. And this visual sort of gives you a sense of what we cover, which is very comprehensive both on the World Bank side and IFC side, along with the other sovereign banks such as IDB and their counterpart institutions such as IDB Invest as one example. We work with the multilateral development banks, help resolve problems, identify key contacts, and help basically disseminate business opportunities. Like I said earlier, we want to make sure that Canadian firms are represented well. So we have between OLIFI and the Climate Finance Trade Commissioners representation in Washington, in Bridgetown, next to the Caribbean Development Bank, in London, in Abidjan, in Beijing, next to the Asia Infrastructure Bank, in Manila, which is next to the Asia Development Bank. So I just want to give you a quick overview of climate finance. And I won't read through the slides, although I do want to highlight the fact that you know, it's by no surprise, there is a lot of climate finance flows into climate finance, particularly after the COP26 in Glasgow. So globally, in 2019, there was about $622 billion were estimated in global climate flows. And, you know, the definition of that, it would be a whole other presentation. But just to show that we have a significant amount. In Canada, for its part, has followed up with its $2.65 billion commitment that it made in Paris in 2015 with a $5.3 billion commitment to climate finance, and is also leading the initiative along with Germany to see how countries can mobilize a $100 billion commitment they made in 2015, which we are short of, to assisting developing countries. So here is just a visual on how climate finance flows work. Here, the point is really that it's not simple. It's not that you know, Canada or other countries put money in and then companies and organizations can get it directly. It goes through a number of actors, intermediaries, into a number of instruments, which provide a really catalytic view and a catalytic just perspective on how climate finance can really work to help poverty, eliminate poverty, and address climate issues. So, you know, as you know, today we're talking about SOGI and disability. And I think that all sort of falls under the broader rubric of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And if you go and you actually read the policy, you'll see this vision, which is to eradicate poverty and build a more peaceful, inclusive world, basically, and by empowering women and girls, the most effective approach to achieve those goals. But as you'll see a little bit later, it also sort of goes into helping vulnerable groups. And right now, 95% of Canada's international assistance integrates gender considerations or directly addresses gender inequality, which is significant. I mean, when you talk to the executive directors and the people who sit on those boards, they will tell you that gender considerations are key to looking at how they evaluate investments when they come to the vote on the board. And then just going into disabilities and SOGI, or sexual orientation and gender identity. This is the Prime Minister's mandate letter to Minister Sajjan, which is the Minister for International Development. And so he highlights that it's important to provide greater assistance to people with disabilities, to advance gender equality and LGBTQ rights abroad, and mobilize and provide climate finance in order to support developing country adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. So, what we're seeing here is that there's a really concerted effort around climate finance from the government, which translates into my job in helping Canadian companies who are very capable promote these aspects as we're developing projects in the emerging markets and developing countries. So with that, I wanted to introduce Kelly. Kelly is fortunately a really good and personal friend of mine. She's also the economic inclusion advisor at IFC. And she's worked as an advocate, as a network leader for 15 plus years. She's been really keen in advising leadership within the World Bank on policy and procedures to improve workplace inclusion. And she's also a member of the World Bank Sexual Orientation Gender Identity Task Force and the World Bank's Task Force on Disabilities. And prior to this, she was the Global Head of Knowledge and Learning at IFC, where she provided really good instruments in knowledge and learning solutions across the corporation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kelly for her presentation.
Thanks, Fahim. And I will attempt to share my screen. If you could unshare yours.
Sorry, my technology is not working very well.
Okay, let's go with this. So you should now be able to see my screen.
Yep.
And we'll go from the beginning. Okay, excellent. Well, thanks for the introduction, Fahim, and thanks for you all for inviting me here today for this kind of whistle-stop tour. Obviously, IFC does many things. All of it is underpinned by how we can better meet the development challenges and be as inclusive as possible. So I'm going to spend the next 20 or so minutes kind of providing a frame to give you some data and information on kind of investing in inclusion. And I'm going to specifically touch a little bit about gender, but mainly focus on disability and then sexual orientation and gender identity. It's super, super important. There's no way we're going to meet our SDG goals and our ambition of leaving no one behind unless we really think about this strategically. So what am I going to do? I'm going to give you some definitions. I'm going to share why it's important, what the data and evidence is telling us, refresh you on the gender lens and what you're seeing. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the gender lens, and then think a bit about how it can be applied to other inclusion groups, and that will be disability and then LGBTI, or sexual orientation, gender identity. It's going to be whistle stop. Each one of these subjects could take at least 2 hours each, but I'm going to do it abridged style in about 20 or so minutes. So let's begin. I'm sure that all of you have already begun your journey on inclusion in your companies and in your groups. I just wanted to recap on what we mean by diversity, and you can see the definition there, and then also what we mean by inclusion. There's a lot of talk, obviously, in the private sector around DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just wanted to kind of underline 3 key points here for us to think about when we're thinking about inclusion overall and generally. One is participation. Have you got everybody at your table? And is everybody equally participating and sharing their thoughts and ideas with you? 2, non-discrimination. Absolutely key and very tricky, because there are a lot of legal frameworks which impact people's ability to engage and even to participate. And the third piece is accessibility. Are your products and solutions and programs accessible for everybody? And by everybody, that means beyond people who are like you, but across the entire spectrum of cognitive, visual, auditory, motor, and speech disabilities. So just something to think about there. Why is it important? It's absolutely critical, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted here for private sector development. There's well-evidenced macro benefits that open, inclusive, and diverse societies are better for economic growth, and discrimination actually damages long-term economic prospects. For example, globally, the countries lose 172 trillion in wealth in lifetime earning gaps between men and women. And there are similar costs of exclusion for LGBTI people and also for disability. The finance gap for women-owned businesses and women-owned small and medium enterprises in emerging markets is about 1.5 trillion. So there are many untapped markets, and as perspectives have not been considered and sections of societies are underserved, there's opportunity as norms change. Data becomes more evident, and we understand that diversity is more critical, for the private sector. At the firm level, studies show that organizations who pay attention to diversity, equity, and inclusion find it easier to attract and retain talent. They increase their revenue, they increase their innovation, they have improved productivity as people feel safer to be themselves at work, they have an improved market share, an enhanced reputation and brand value, and then greater customer orientation because they're considering everybody, and greater collaboration. Obviously, COVID-19 has had a horrendous impact globally, and especially on the private sector, and the impact on the gains for economic inclusion and inclusion in general have been pretty tremendous, especially for gender equality. We see a rise in violence against women. We see a rise in unpaid care work, and that rise not only hurts growth of businesses, but also economies, but also the women themselves, their families, and their communities. It's also had impact on other underserved or vulnerable communities. For example, Ford Foundation have recently published the fact that COVID-19 will have produced an extra 85 million persons with disabilities because of the effects of long COVID before vaccinations had got here. And also LGBTI workers who often are found in more either the informal sector or in hospitality have been really impacted by lockdowns, etc. So the World Bank Group, IFC, all of the multilaterals are really focused on what we call the grid, the green, resilient and inclusive development. It's us doubling down on our commitment to meet those development challenges, and really the opportunity for us all, including the private sector, to course correct as we move into the 21st century. So again, why is it important? So there's quite a lot of demand pressure from the market. You're seeing a shift in the information age. We're all living on our tablets, on our phones. Information is available. If you want to know about anything, it's available. That was not the case 20 years ago. So people are more informed, correctly or incorrectly, but the information is there. We are more interconnected, and we are literally living in a global society. You start to see the shifts in the social movements that we've all experienced over the last couple of years with the Me Too movement, the BLM, Black Lives Matter, and then the move towards LGBT equality. And we also see shifting generations in the workplace and additional generations in the workplace. And that has an impact on how people want to be treated in the workplace, which has an impact on how businesses are run. The other shift is to note is around the shift in generational wealth. And I think the silent generation and boomers upon their death will transfer an estimated 30 to 68 trillion to adult children. So if you have a more inclusive generation behind, the hypothesis goes that you're going to have more inclusive solutions coming our way. And that's really focused the social push on CEOs. They're understanding why it's critical for their business. So you're seeing demand from governments and supranationals on green and decarbonisation targets, as Fahim was mentioning, and you're seeing, taxonomies. So, for example, the EU taxonomy on impact coming out for both green and sustainability, and also for social. We're seeing regulators shift here. For example, the FCC on board composition shifted in 2021, so it requires most of the 3,000 companies on the NASDAQ to have at least one woman on their board of directors, along with one person from a racial minority or who identifies as LGBTI. And it also requires companies to disclose statistics on the demographic composition of their boards. You see pressure from investors like IFC, who have long been kind of impact investors. We have principles of non-discrimination and inclusion, and we have performance standards that we're expecting from the private sector that we invest in. You're seeing requests from employees who are voting with their feet. You've all heard about the Great Resignation. That's going to become more and more important as we see these shifting generations in the workplace. And also consumers are, choosing who and the brands that they, best fit their personal identities. In terms of marketplace responses, just to give you some facts and figures around the volumes, and I'm sure you're aware of some of this, S&P Global Ratings expects global issuance of sustainable bonds, including green, social, sustainable, and sustainability-linked bonds to surpass 1.5 trillion in 2022. That's still only 17% of 2022 issuance, but it's significant and it's growing. As more financing structures and innovative financing structures are created, we're going to see more money going that way. And I know that in January 2022, IFC issued a benchmark 5-year social bond raising 500 million Canadian dollars for sustainable investments, which was fantastic to see. We're also seeing a rise in ESG reporting, and I'm sure you're all feeling this as well. A third of all professionally managed assets, 30 to 40 trillion, are now subject to ESG criteria. And this obviously leads to massive concerns about greenwashing, pink washing, purple washing for disability, or just in general social washing. How are we really making sure that all this money is having the impact that we said we wanted it to? So for this, you're seeing the development of lots of principles. You have the International Capital Markets Association and IFC building out their social bonds, sustainability linked bonds and green bonds principles. You have the impact principles from IFC, and you also have a number of other groups who have pulled out their principles. There is a lot of work to do on this impact harmonization. I think that's really where we are right now. We see some moves in the marketplace to harmonize impact. It's easier on green and climate because you can count, not quite so easy on social because we're dealing with people. And I think it's still a very nascent market here and lots of room for, for moving forward. So now let me talk to you through kind of the gender lens and then how it can be potentially applicable for other groups as well. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. So this is actually from the 2X Plus campaign, which you may or may not have known about, which was still raising a lot of money to ensure that finance flows through to gender specific. And it's really about simply thinking about the work that different stakeholders can have and deliver in a company. It's useful to identify and measure gaps and develop interventions and also markets. And we use it at IFC in the Gender and Economic Inclusion Group, because obviously we're providing investment and advice to private sector to identify gaps in the marketplace and then also develop solutions that then the private sector can come in and help us invest in. So just to think about this from a gender lens, we're thinking about women as leaders, women in employment, products and services which are specific for women, and then also women entrepreneurs. And just to give you an example of some of the work we've done around entrepreneurship. So we identified a gap, as I said previously, for women-owned and small and medium enterprises in emerging markets. It's about 1.5 trillion. And to do that, to help to meet that gap, we've built out solutions like our Banking on Women program, which you may know. And as of June 2021, that program has mobilized and invested over 3 billion in financial institutions, specifically to finance women-led SMEs. We also have e-commerce markets in Africa that we've identified as having a 300 billion opportunity. And we launched 2 Women in E-commerce reports, highlighting a 280 billion opportunity for e-commerce markets in Southeast Asia and over 14.5 billion Africa if gaps between sales between women and men were closed between 2025 and 2030. Just to give you a sense of the overall volume here that we're talking from a gender perspective of the money that's going in just from the G7 development finance institutes, they collectively committed 7 billion between 2018 and 2020, and then mobilized another 3 billion from private investors. And in 2021 June, they raised that because they smashed their target. They raised the gender-led investment target to 15 billion and are well on their way to doing that. And just lastly on that, I don't know whether you're aware of Project Sage. It's a great report on gender lens investing, and Project Sage 4.0, which is the latest report, which is delivered by Wharton School of Business and Catalyst at Large, shows a 250% growth in funds, broadly defined, who invest with a gender lens between 2017 and 2021. So here you see on the right some of the example indicators that are being used to measure, because this is the critical piece. How do I measure? How do I share my impact of what I'm doing? And you can see here some of the measures that are being used. Essentially, trillions of dollars can be unlocked here, and it's really important that we think of all about this through either through direct investing in entrepreneurs, in leadership, looking at our own workforces, thinking about the products and services that we're providing, and then also thinking about how we better invest through financial intermediaries. And it is when we go through the next 2 groups, I'd like you to keep this in mind, because I think this is a really nice structure for us to think about how we can then expand this beyond the gender lens to other inclusion lenses. And with that, I'm going to whistle stop you through LGBTI, A, Q, SOGI, SEC. These are lots of definitions here, and I'm sure you're aware of some of them. The World Bank Group uses LGBT and I, essentially, because they are people's experiences that we can capture from a data perspective. There are lots of other ways to capture one's experience of sexual orientation or one's gender identity. It's really important that we think about LGBTI in development, essentially because we're trying to meet our SDG objectives, but also that LGBTI people are most underrepresented and also often most marginalized. They're still criminalized in 69 countries around the globe, and also marginalized in many, and I'm sure even in Canada, you'll have seen some of the impacts here. They are subject to legal frameworks and shifting cultural norms, but that's also a good and a bad thing. And with LGBTI development, you see 1 step forward and 2 steps back, and then 1 step forward again. There is hopeful research there. So in 2018, there was an OECD report that shows the differences in generational awarenesses. And again, I talked about generations being really important here. Generation Z and Y are leading the way. So in terms of how many people feel comfortable to be out, that was, OECD found that it was 1.4% for people born before 1945, 2.4% for the boomers, 3.5 for my generation, Generation X, and then 8.2 for millennials. So you're looking at a really inclusive group of adults who are moving through the world and moving through to investment. Now, I would be remiss here to not talk about the challenge of data. It's very difficult to count LGBT people, especially in countries where it is criminalized. But there is moves afoot here, and you can see in the middle of the screen, this is a UNDP and a World Bank Group initiative to come up with an LGBTI inclusion index, which looks at data sources and what's currently available. It's super nascent, as I said, but it has already started. And there are obviously macro costs of exclusion, which I alluded to and talked a bit about gender. Well, here you have on the right-hand side, the cost of exclusion from various reports for LGBTI people. So in India, that's 1% of GDP. That was, incidentally, that figure was used when India decriminalized homosexuality in 2018. So data does and is important, does make an impact. And then recent reports by Open for Business show that it's a 1.3 billion impact in Kenya, and then also a 4.2 billion impact in the Caribbean. That's the English speaking Caribbean. So let's talk a little bit more about the business case here. We've pulled some numbers out for you in terms of global purchasing power. That's 4 to 5 trillion. Global household wealth, 23 trillion. The global LGBTI population, again, as I said, it's difficult to count LGBTI people. So Gallup has it at 5.8%. The World Bank Group at this time is happy to talk about it being 10% of the population across sexual orientation and gender identity. And then obviously you see the return on equity here is 13, I think it's 13% per annum from a financial performance perspective and a benchmark. So super interesting. People don't really often understand that these numbers is not a small community. This is a large community with often have a large reach in different markets. The business case, so why do we talk about LGBTI, especially in a private sector and a business perspective, has been pretty well defined with some really good data by Open for Business. And that's one of the reports, and I will share the links I'll share with you after. But there are really kind of 3 pieces, and they've done a good job on the economic case, basically showing that open and inclusive societies are better for economic growth, and it hurts long-term prosperity. They also shown that from a business perspective and also from an individual perspective around people working in open and diverse and inclusive environments perform better. Boosting this kind of performance and environment has the knock-on effect, and often candidates who see private sector who have an LGBTI open commitment and policy make assumptions about the overall inclusiveness of that company. So it's a really interesting knock-on effect. And to that end, let's talk a bit about workplace inclusion here and give you some stats. So in a study of 450 global companies with revenues above 750 million, they show that inclusive companies had 2.3 times higher cash flow per employee over a 3-year period. And the effect is even greater for smaller companies, which had 13 times higher mean cash flow from their operations. There is an open question, obviously, on geography. You heard me talk about 69 countries where it is criminalized, but norms and legal opinions have become more pronounced across regions and different regions. And when we see the difference between Africa and Latin America, for example, but the trend is for greater acceptance and equality. As I said, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And just to tell you that based on a global attitude survey conducted since 2002 by the Pew Research Center, the global trend is for broader acceptance everywhere. And I think from my perspective, that's down to the increasing information and experience and people being able to see themselves. And many of the countries surveyed between 2013 and 2019 have had double-digit increase in the acceptance of homosexuality, including South Africa, India with its decriminalization in 2018, and also Turkey. So difficult, some of the difficult markets are also moving. And from this, take your SOGI LGBTI hat off, and I'm going to flip you to disabilities. So disabilities, and what you see in front of you is the definition from the UN Convention of Rights with Persons with Disabilities, which defines a lot of the laws and policies and has all governments as signatories. And you can see they use what I call the medical model of disability here. Why is this important for us in developing markets? Well, again, this is not a small market. You are looking at over 1 billion or 15% of the population. And think about disability in 3 categories. One, that you have a permanent disability, so you're born with a disability. 2, that it's a situational disability, which everybody faces. For example, driving at night reduces your vision. And then you can also have temporary disabilities. For example, you may have broken your arm and therefore cannot open the door properly or open a can of soup. It's also ubiquitous. And you can see there are challenges specifically for women in employment. Women make up half the population, obviously, but we also all age into a disability. I didn't have these glasses 15 years ago. I have my glasses now. I'm sure many of you have glasses on today as well. And more than 46% of older people aged 60 or over have disabilities. By 2030, 1 in 6 people will be aged 60 or over globally, and the share of population will increase from 1 billion to 1.4 billion. Aging populations, as I'm sure some of you feel, I definitely feel this in the morning, it leads to common complaints and conditions such as hearing loss, a bit of back pain, a bit of neck pain, but then that can also lead to chronic issues as well. And the pace of population aging is aging rapidly and increasing in many countries. So for example, why France had almost 150 years to adapt to a change from 10% to 20% in the proportion of their population, which was 60 or over. Places such as Brazil, China, and India will have slightly more than 20 years to make these adaptations. So when you're thinking about disability, think about those 3 aspects and also think about aging. And aging also leads us to the rise of the importance of accessible technology, which we'll talk a little bit about here. Obviously, health epidemics, as I said, have a huge impact here. You heard me talk about 85 million extra people who will be added. And it also has a whole heap of economic costs. So there are some stats which say that the global GDP lost annually due to disability was estimated at 1.37 trillion and 1.97 trillion with the total cost for low-income countries estimated between 135 and 192 billion. So this is a huge impact on our economies. And if you can't remember those stats, just think about this one. Nations forego essentially up to 7% of their GDP due to the exclusion of persons with disabilities. And it's important to note here, this is what I have on the right, the medical model, which is the definition by the CRPD, and then also the social model. And this is gaining a lot of traction from persons with disabilities for us, which enables us to really think about shifting our perceptions between persons with disabilities being different and outside a norm to actually being part of a norm. And my favorite quote is there from you. It's the stairs make the building inaccessible, not the wheelchair. And that's from Wendy Chisholm, who is the Microsoft Chief Accessibility Architect and the author of Web Accessibility Guidelines. So just have that in mind as you're thinking about these things. Now let's talk a bit about the market opportunities here and the business case. So I'm sure you recognize that landmass on the left. The disabled market is larger than China. It's estimated at 1.85 billion people worldwide who have a disposable income of 1.9 trillion. This figure jumps to 13 trillion USD in disposable income when we account for family members, caregivers, and others who prioritize the goods and services that are inclusive of persons with disabilities. You also need to think a bit about the broader market, and you can see Audible there on the right. So lots of people benefit from what were initially disability inclusive inventions. So audiobooks were created in 1932 by the American Foundation for the Blind, and now there's about 55 million people listening to an audiobook each year, and that number grows. It's also important to think about digital inclusion. Ensuring that you have an inclusive web presence is really important. 69% of shoppers are going to click away from your website, or people who want to engage with are going to click away if it was too difficult to use, regardless of disability. over 1 billion people around the world require the use of assistive technology, and you can see there on the left-hand side. And yet only 5 to 15% of this population have access to it. And that figure is set to rise to 2 billion people by 2015 due to the aging populations that we talked a bit about, and also the increased prevalence of non-communicable diseases. The ROI for assistive tech has been identified. That's 9 to 1 gains, as access brings value to health, community, and the economy. And if you're more interested in this, then I'd suggest you have a look at 80 scale 2030. And also just interesting to note that 80 patents belonging to emerging technologies of AI, IoT, materials, and biosensors are growing nearly 3 times faster than conventional patent filings. And then the last piece is obviously around talent management and workplace. So 16% of the working adult age population has a disability, and 80% of disabilities are acquired between the ages of 18 and 64 during working age. It is an untapped talent pool. And in the US, 31% are employed compared to 75% of their peers. With disability inclusion, companies get access to a new and innovative talent pool of over 10.7 million people. And that's why you see a lot of the private sector, especially in America right now, really focused on how can they be more inclusive of persons with disabilities. In an Accenture study, companies who invested in disability inclusion had 28% higher revenue. They doubled their net income and had 30% profit margins. It's clearly a market for disability inclusive goods and services with a huge need and massive investment potential for assistive tech, and also a focus on workplace inclusion. So my final thoughts, obviously investing, I think clearly I've drunk the Kool-Aid. I think investing in inclusion is the right thing to do, and it's also becoming increasingly important for companies. It continues to be important for investors like IFC. It has this importance to our reputation and brand in the marketplace. The business case is becoming far more and more evidence. Markets are starting to take shape, especially in emerging markets. We're seeing increased regulatory pressures, and that there are new marketplace opportunities that we just haven't thought about yet. So these are the questions I would leave you with. Who is at your decision-making table or your project design table? How are you considering everybody? How are your workplace engaged in creating these conditions for inclusion? How are your products and services inclusive of everybody? And how is your due diligence in actually capturing inclusion gaps? This is around the participation piece we talked about. And how are you listening to the different communities when you're building out your projects? And with that, thank you very much. I think I've just about met my whistle-stop tour. Back to you, Fahim.
Great. No, thank you. This is a great presentation and actually quite eye-opening. I appreciated the stats. So I have a bunch of questions, but I'll go to a couple of questions that came in the Q&A first. One, I'll answer. If you have opportunities that you're looking for to mobilize finance, like the one in Africa that Yovi had mentioned, please do contact us. I put my email into the chat, and we can discuss and point you in the right direction within the Trade Commissioner Service. Kelly, you had mentioned a report. Do you have a link to the report? I believe the report's not available yet, right?
Which report? I mentioned many reports.
Sorry, it was a report on SOGI inclusion. Well, regardless, we'll send out these presentations and.
I think maybe it was the Open for Business. There are a whole host of Open for Business reports, which I think are very useful for people who have not really considered LGBTI in a business and operational sense from the private sector perspective. So I'll send those links out. I think they would be a great starter for that.
Yeah, I think that would be great and really informative for people to understand. What I wanted to ask was from a project development perspective. We have a number of Canadian clients that are looking to develop, let's say, a solar project in Senegal. what suggestions do you have for them to integrate SOGI considerations and disability considerations and even gender considerations into that project design so that they can speak to these issues and, you know, make themselves a little bit more attractive to IFC investing?
No, sure. I think the first place I'd start is our performance standards. So I would look through them. So even these were written in 2012, and LGBTI is also included there in workplace inclusion and then covered under non-discrimination. So I would familiarize yourself with those. And then, as I say, I would be connecting essentially with people in the country and NGOs to make sure that you have those voices at the table. Because unless you have them in your project room when you're developing them, how are you really, and everything is context specific. We're working in very specific either cultural contexts or geographic contexts. So I would make sure that when I was doing project design, that we are connected with those kind of NGOs. And you know, there are a lot of professional NGOs. If you are not sure about where to start to find some of these more organized NGOs, then for disability, I would think about the International Disability Association website, that's IDA, not to be confused with the World Bank Group IDA, which is a different thing, but again, we'll give you the link. And then also, if you're looking for LGBTI, I would be looking at the UN Free and Equal website and connecting with them. If you cannot find it through a Google search, because oftentimes there are not very many of these groups, and they all have a web presence and you can normally find them. So I would be thinking about how can we better be inclusive of those people by speaking to the people and getting their input.
Okay, that's helpful, and those resources are actually helpful too. I was going to ask about that. You talked about how you measure gender and gender inclusiveness, but there is some difficulty in measuring SOGI and disability, particularly given the two models that you presented, versus the medical model versus the social model. What needs to happen next to make sure that these measurements are fair and can be integrated into investment processes?
Well, as I said, it is a nascent area, especially for SOGI and for disability. So thinking about inclusion in kind of these broad terms and asking yourself those questions, you know, around participation, around non-discrimination, around greater access. Measurement is going to be contextual to the situation, given the fact there are legal frameworks which impact both LGBTI and also persons with disabilities. And that's why that connection with NGOs is really critical. We are starting to see, we are starting to see movement on the social impact measuring lens, if you want to call it like that. So building out of the gender lens. And if I was an investor looking for somewhere to start, I would be looking at either the IFC impact principles or I think it's the IMP, or even the GIN, the Global Impact Investing Network. They have quite a nice set of impact measures. So they're where the tools are right now. There is this, to your point around the social model, and instead of the financial model or the medical model, that's why it's so important. And both communities, LGBTI and persons with disabilities, have this moniker of nothing without us, nothing for us without us. And you see that a lot. I don't know whether any of you know, it's the Global Disability Summit started today. And that's a very key message that is coming around, project design, project development. Do not be developing these projects without us in the room. We will share with you what impacts this may have on you, because unless we're asking the people who are going to be most impacted, we're never going to be able to create that system of impact measurement that we really need, which will really ensure that our projects and programs are as impactful as possible. Okay,
great. And how can people attend the summit?
Oh, so it's live now. We can send a link straight out to everybody. It's hosted by the governments of Ghana and Norway. It's really interesting because 3 years ago in 2018, which was the first disability summit, lots of people were asked to commit, including the Government of Canada, who will have made commitments on disability inclusion and development. And this is really an opportunity for groups to share what they've done with their commitments and then make new commitments going into the next 2-year cycle. There are lots of really interesting sessions that are available. The webinars will all be available. They were all inclusive, so they all have voice captioning and probably sign language as well. So yeah, it's super interesting. A lot of them are very early for East Coast or West Coast timing. So I've there was one at 5 o'clock this morning. I did not do that one, but I will absolutely get the webinar. So I really suggest that you kind of have a look and explore if you're interested in exploring the disability lens.
Isn't everybody awake at 5 in the morning?
Well, what's today?
You had, I know we have a few minutes left, but an interesting trend that we're seeing is the move to remote work, particularly after the Great Resignation. I assume that that is good for people with disabilities, but am I wrong? Like, what is your sort of perspective on how the workplace is changing, and how that will affect people with disabilities? Will it make them hinder their ability to get a job? Do you have any?
Sure. No, absolutely. So we have to be clear about the jobs that could be worked from home versus all jobs. So, in organizations like IFC or in some of the private sector organizations who work in offices, then the shift to remote work was actually really useful. But it was useful, I think, for everybody. Pluses and minuses. Obviously, cats tearing into your Zoom or children, interrupting you, provide some challenges. But I think from a disability perspective, and I've heard this from some of our IFC and World Bank Group disability colleagues who have a disability, it's really allowed them to kind of break some of the institutional norms of presenteeism. And I think we've all found that there is no reason for you to be in the office just to be seen. You can absolutely do your work. And I think that has been really useful, and I think that will echo. The challenge is, I think personally, that workplaces and leadership need to hold their nerve, because they've done it for 3 years. It's worked. It's been successful in many cases, and it's been super useful for persons with disabilities because they haven't had to factor in transport. They've been able to sit in their own chairs, or how they'll be able to take breaks as they needed. So all of their kind of accommodations, which is what we call in the workplace, they've been able to manage much better because they've been in their own homes and they've been able to be more effective. So I'm just hoping that it doesn't shift back the other way. You see a lot of noise in the press around Goldman Sachs and some of the big banks. Everybody has to come back. And I'm like, well, we are the 21st century. We've just shown we can do it. It really is time to wake up, which says a lot about gender balance in the workplace and who's making these decisions. But that's my own personal view.
No, I think that's a good perspective. You had mentioned how the private sector is driving change in developing markets and emerging markets, and you provided some examples. Do you have an example of where IFC has asked, let's say, financial institutions to be more inclusive, or where the private sector has on its own been catalytic in sort of accepting LGBTQI plus communities and SOGI communities?
Yeah, no, sure. It is interesting because the private sector is often moves faster than development finance organizations because they're more global. They need to ensure that their staff, wherever they are, because they're governed by regulators, need to be providing for them and for their safety. So they've been really focused on this, especially financial institutions, probably for the last 20 or so years, and have been kind of grappling with it. There are some really good examples of how businesses have come together in countries where it is challenging to be LGBTI. And the examples I'd give you would be in Kenya, where Open for Business, and part of their model is that they create groups of businesses who come together, who talk a bit about LGBTI in the workplace, what the difficulties are. They come together to try and influence government for legal changes. So they put in a petition, and we see that in the US with amicus briefs. There were similar actions in Kenya. There's also been similar actions in Eastern Europe, which obviously have had a bit of a backsliding in terms of LGBT rights there. And then also another example, LAC is really interesting and really kind of opening up in terms of the cultural norms and some of the shifts in society. And we see a lot of private sector companies working with the LGBTI Chamber of Commerce to think about how they might better diversify their supply chains, looking at medium and small enterprises who are LGBTI run. So we're seeing private sector kind of opening up to the opportunity that this really is, which is talent management, getting the best people in. And also, as I said, from a lens perspective, it's about consumers as well as doing the right thing. So lots of movement and faster movement from private sector, plus they're regulated, plus ESG concerns, which is really driving the need to do the right thing, I think.
Right. Well, I think that's good. I think that's our time. I have plenty of other questions that I could follow up on. But I'll hand it over to Alexia. But before I do that, thank you so much, Kelly, for
thank you for listening and following me on a whistle stop tour.
No, this is we don't get a lot of coverage on SOGI and disability lens investing, and so this was really helpful. So Alexia, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Fahim. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you a lot for your time today and for all those explanations. I would like to thank you also our participants. We are now at the end of this webinar. As a reminder, I will send you a follow-up email tomorrow. Once again, I invite you all to complete the survey that will be sent to you. It will be really appreciated. We will also make the video recording available on our website in a few days. Thank you again, dear participants, and Kelly and Fahim for your excellent presentation. It was a pleasure having you here today. Thank you for joining us today and engaging in the question period. On behalf of the Chamber of Commerce of Metropolitan Montreal, I wish you all a good day and hope to see you at our next events. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.